I've always said that if you want to see someone's true face, wait for their moment of greatest triumph. That's when the mask slips. That's when they think they're untouchable. The air on the rooftop of the Meridian was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the kind of self-congratulatory chatter that only exists in Manhattan's elite circles. We were there to celebrate my daughter, Madison, summa cum laude, Ivy League honors. The kind of achievement that should have made any father swell with pride. Jeffrey stood at the head of the table, his crystal flute catching the glow of the sunset over Central Park. He looked every bit the successful developer, the man I had spent 30 years building from the ground up. Then, he cleared his throat. The room went silent. "I've decided to start a new life without you," he said. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull me aside. He said it to the room, to our daughter, to the friends we'd known for decades. Across the table, Tiffany, a junior architect from Jeffrey's firm, didn't even have the decency to look away. She just smirked, her eyes tracing the rim of her glass. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. They were waiting for me to gasp, to shatter a glass, to let the hysterical wife take center stage so Jeffrey could play the victim of a dying marriage. Instead, I felt the cold condensation of my water glass against my palm, and I smiled. "Congratulations on your honesty, Jeffrey," I said. My voice was steady. It was clinical. It was the sound of a ledger being closed. Before I stood to leave, I reached into my handbag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. I placed it gently on the white linen, right next to his untouched steak. "Something for you to review when the party's over," I added. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't look back. I walked toward the elevator, the clicking of my heels the only sound in the suffocating silence. Jeffrey thought he was making an announcement. He didn't realize he was just signing his own professional death warrant. "Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." The elevator ride down from the rooftop felt like a decompression chamber. In the restaurant, the air had been thin, oxygen-starved by Jeffrey's ego. Out here, in the cool Manhattan night, I could finally breathe. I didn't head for the car right away. I stood on the sidewalk, the neon lights of the city reflecting off the polished toes of my shoes. I opened my phone. My hands remained perfectly still. This wasn't a moment for grief. It was a moment for execution. I opened our shared banking app, the one Jeffrey assumed I only used to pay the utility bills. He had no idea that as a forensic auditor, I had spent the last 6 months mapping every hidden artery of his financial life. He thought he was cleverly moving money into shell companies to fund his new life with Tiffany. He didn't realize that I was the one who had quietly flagged those accounts for suspicious activity with the bank's compliance department weeks ago. I sent a single text to my private investigator. He went public. Initiate the lockdown. Seconds later, my phone buzzed. A notification from our primary business account. Jeffrey had just tried to close the rooftop tab. Declined. $7,200. I could almost hear his voice echoing from 40 stories up, that sharp, entitled bark he used when things didn't go his way. He would be red-faced, fumbling for his gold card, then his corporate platinum. One by one, they would fail. I had spent 28 years ensuring his world stayed upright. It took me exactly 12 seconds to let it tip. "Mom?" I turned to see Madison standing at the restaurant entrance. Her graduation gown was draped over her arm, her eyes shimmering with a mix of shock and a sudden, sharp clarity. She was my daughter in every sense. She didn't come out crying. She came out looking for the blueprint. "He's still up there," she whispered, glancing back at the elevators. "He's arguing with the manager." "Mom, he told everyone he was moving Tiffany into the penthouse." "Our penthouse." I reached out and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "He can tell them he's moving to the moon, Madison. It doesn't make it his property. Come on." "We're going to your Aunt Diana's." "What about the house, Mom? Your things?" "The locks are being changed as we speak, honey." "And the penthouse Jeffrey is so fond of?" "It's held by an LLC that he hasn't looked at the fine print of in a decade. He thinks he's the king of the castle, but he forgot who actually holds the deed." As we pulled away from the curb, I saw Jeffrey emerge from the building, Tiffany trailing behind him like a confused shadow. He was shouting into his phone, likely at a customer service representative who couldn't help him. He looked small. For the first time in 30 years, the man who thought he was a giant looked exactly like what he was. A fraud whose credit had finally run out. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the reliable one. For 30 years, I wasn't just Jeffrey's wife. I was his unpaid chief financial officer, his crisis manager, and his silent investor. I remember the 2008 crash, when the world was folding and Jeffrey sat in our kitchen, head in his hands, ready to declare bankruptcy. I was the one who pulled my entire inheritance money, my grandmother intended for my own security, and injected it into his failing firm. I didn't ask for a contract. I didn't ask for interest. I asked for a partnership. But Jeffrey didn't want a partner. He wanted a safety net he could walk all over. As I sat in the quiet of Diana's guest room, the blue light of my laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the dark. I opened a file hidden 3 layers deep in a cloud drive he didn't even know existed. I called it Project Clarity. It was a reconstruction of our lives in numbers. 6 months ago, a discrepancy of $12,000 had caught my eye. To most, it's a rounding error in a construction budget. To me, it was a cent. I followed it. I found the leak, a steady bleed of funds redirected from his primary operating account into an offshore LLC called T-Square Holdings. T for Tiffany. $1,800,000. That was the price of his new life. He hadn't built that wealth. He had harvested it from the margins of our shared sacrifices. He had been skimming from the college fund I meticulously grew for Madison. He had deferred maintenance on our rental properties while buying a $250,000 condo for a woman who wasn't even born when we bought our first home. I looked at the spreadsheets, the cold, hard evidence of 30 years of invisible labor being liquidated for a midlife cliché. This brings me to a truth I wish I'd realized sooner. To anyone listening who feels like they are the invisible backbone of their family, this is for you. We often think that by working harder, by giving more, by being the shadow that keeps the lights on, we are earning loyalty. But in the eyes of a taker, your sacrifice isn't a gift, it's a baseline. They don't see your effort, they only see their own comfort. When you find yourself at the edge, marginalized in the very life you built, remember this. The person who keeps the books is the only one who truly knows what the business is worth. And I knew, down to the last cent, that Jeffrey was bankrupt in every way that mattered. My compassion had been a luxury he'd overdrafted for years. I stared at the T-Square ledger and felt a wave of clinical calm. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was his auditor, and the audit was about to become public. The colonial house on Westover Drive had always been my sanctuary. I had picked out every floorboard, every backsplash, and every curtain. But when I pulled into the driveway 2 days after the graduation massacre, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a crime scene. Jeffrey's black SUV was parked crookedly on the lawn, a blatant disregard for the landscaping I spent thousands to maintain. As I walked up to the front door, I reached for my keys, but my fingers met a new lock. Brass, cheap, not the high-security system I'd installed. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't scream. I simply pulled out my phone, opened the home security app, and used the master override code Jeffrey didn't know existed. The electronic bolt slid back with a soft, clinical thud. I walked into the foyer to find the air smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine, something floral, cloying, and far too young. Tiffany was standing in the middle of my living room, holding a roll of neon green move stickers. She was currently placing one on the corner of my grandmother's antique mahogany desk. "You're not supposed to be here," Tiffany said, her voice lacking the smugness it had at the restaurant. Now, she just sounded nervous. "I live here," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "You, however, are trespassing." Jeffrey emerged from the kitchen, a beer in his hand. He looked disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled. He tried to summon his old authority, puffing out his chest. "Valerie, stop this. I told you, I'm starting over. The locks are changed." This house is part of the business assets, and since I'm the CEO, you're the CEO of a company that currently has its credit facilities frozen by a federal auditor, I interrupted. And if you'd bothered to read the deed to this specific property, you'd see it's held by a trust in Madison's name, with me as the sole trustee until her 25th birthday. It is not, and has never been, a business asset. I watched the color drain from his face. He looked at Tiffany, then back at me. He was like a man who had built a skyscraper on sand and was just now feeling the tide come in. You can't do this, he stammered. I have nowhere else to go. The accounts. The bank said they're under review. They are, I said, walking toward the desk and peeling the green sticker off the mahogany. I crumpled it into a ball and dropped it into the trash. And until that review is complete, you are a guest in my daughter's house. A guest who has exactly 30 minutes to pack a suitcase and leave before the police arrive to escort a trespasser off the premises. Tiffany looked at Jeffrey, expecting him to fight. But Jeffrey just stared at me, seeing for the first time the woman I actually was, not the glorified bookkeeper he'd ignored for decades, but a forensic predator who had finally found her prey. I watched them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a doomed species. They weren't fighting for love. They were fighting for furniture. And I had already won the house. They say that anger is a fire, but in my profession, anger is an ice bath. It's what you use to preserve the evidence. As I sat in the war room of Diana's guest house, a space now filled with 3 monitors, a high-speed scanner, and 2 decades' worth of tax returns, I felt a familiar, chilling precision settle over me. Jeffrey had spent years treating our business as a magic trick, moving money from one pocket to another, hoping the audience wouldn't notice the sleight of hand. But he'd forgotten that I was the one who designed the stage. I picked up the phone and dialed the direct line for the regional vice president of our primary lender. Arthur, it's Valerie. I'm calling to trigger the emergency freeze on all accounts associated with the Caldwell Group. Yes, including the secondary payroll. I've just uploaded the affidavit of suspected embezzlement to the portal. Arthur's voice was hesitant. Valerie, Jeffrey is the primary signatory on those lines. And I am the majority shareholder of the holding company that secures them, Arthur. Read the bylaws I drafted in 2012. If the lead auditor flags a discrepancy exceeding 5% of quarterly revenue, the freeze is mandatory. Check your inbox. The discrepancy is currently sitting at 22%. I hung up. No emotion. No regret. This brings me to a concept most people misunderstand about conflict. It's the predator's silence. Jeffrey thought my quietness over the last few months was submission. He thought that because I didn't scream when I found Tiffany's earring in his car, or because I didn't confront him when he lost $50,000 in a bad investment, that I was weak. But silence isn't always a sign of defeat. Sometimes, it's a strategic choice. In the world of forensic auditing, you don't strike when you see the crime. You strike when you have enough evidence to make the conviction inevitable. I didn't want to fight. I wanted an autopsy. Every day I stayed silent was another day I spent tightening the noose, ensuring that when the lockdown happened, there wouldn't be a single loophole for him to crawl through. By noon, the professional fallout was in full swing. My legal team had served the temporary restraining order. Jeffrey's company email was deactivated. His corporate car, a vehicle paid for by a business loan I had personally guaranteed, was flagged for repossession. I watched the clock. At exactly 12:45, my phone began to vibrate. It was Jeffrey. Then a text from Tiffany. Then another from Jeffrey. I didn't answer. I didn't need to hear his voice to know what it sounded like when a man realizes the ground he's standing on has been sold out from under him. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The audit had to be perfect to be lethal. And looking at the red lines populating my screen, I knew I hadn't missed a single cent. The investigation into a financial crime often starts with a grand discovery, but it ends with a single, devastating detail. For me, that detail was a loop in the letter V. I was sitting in Diana's guest room, the clock ticking past midnight, when I opened the scanned PDF of a small business loan Jeffrey had taken out 4 months ago. $400,000. The signature at the bottom read Valerie Caldwell. At first glance, it looked perfect. The slant was right. The pressure seemed consistent. But Jeffrey had forgotten one thing. I am a forensic auditor. I spend my life studying the tiny, subconscious habits people leave behind in ink. I zoomed in 400%. There, in the middle of my first name, was a hesitation. A tiny, microscopic tremor where the pen had lifted and reset. It wasn't my signature. It was a tracing. Jeffrey hadn't just moved money. He had committed a federal crime. He had forged my name to secure a loan that put our personal assets and my professional license on the line. He wasn't just leaving me. He was planning to leave me in a prison cell of debt while he sailed away with Tiffany. Just as the weight of that realization began to crush my chest, my phone buzzed with an incoming file from an unknown encrypted address. I opened it. It was a spreadsheet titled Actual Debt. And the sender? It was an old alias Tiffany had used in college. The kill shot didn't come from my research. It came from the mistress. Tiffany had realized that Jeffrey wasn't the wealthy mogul he pretended to be. She had seen the collection notices I'd started triggering. She realized she was hitched to a sinking ship, and like any opportunist, she was looking for a lifeboat. The file she sent contained Jeffrey's private ledger, the real one. It showed that he didn't have $1,800,000 hidden away. He had lost most of it in high-risk gambling and bad land deals. The money he moved for her was already gone, spent on interest payments for the forged loan. He was a hollow man, a facade of success built on a foundation of lies. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt a cold, hard resolve. Jeffrey thought he was the architect of a new life, but he'd only succeeded in building a cage, and I was the only one with the key. I didn't need to destroy him. I just had to show the world exactly what he had drawn. The office of Caldwell Financial Transitions was quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a controlled demolition. I sat behind my glass desk, the skyline of the city etched in steel and light behind me. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. When Jeffrey burst through the double doors, he didn't look like the man who had stood atop the rooftop bar a week ago. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had the frantic, sweating look of a gambler who had just realized the house always wins. Tiffany wasn't with him. He was alone. "Valerie, you have to stop this," he choked out, leaning heavily on my desk. "The bank. They've called in the loans. All of them. They're saying there's an investigation into the small business credit line. They're talking about fraud, Val. Federal fraud. I didn't invite him to sit. I didn't offer him water. I simply tapped a key on my laptop. A recording began to play. It was the audio from the hidden security camera in our old living room, captured the night he moved Tiffany in. "Valerie trusts me completely," Jeffrey's recorded voice bragged, dripping with a smugness that now sounded pathetic. "She's a glorified bookkeeper, Tiff. She sees the numbers I want her to see. She's her own worst enemy because she's too loyal to look closer. That's her weakness." I paused the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. "I wasn't too loyal to look closer, Jeffrey," I said, my voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. "I was just waiting for you to finish digging the hole. You see, this is the illusion of the empty wallet. You thought your power came from your name, your SUV, and your ability to stand at the head of a table. But you forgot that those things were built on my credit, my inheritance, and my labor. You mistook my support for your own strength." He sank into the chair, his head in his hands. "I'll lose everything. The firm, the reputation. I'll go to prison." "You already lost it," I replied. "The moment you forged my name, you ceased to be a businessman. You became a liability. And as a forensic auditor, my job is to remove liabilities from the balance sheet." I slid a final document across the desk. It wasn't a divorce settlement. It was a confession and a repayment agreement. "Sign this, and I won't hand the secondary ledger Tiffany gave me to the district attorney today. You'll spend the next 20 years working as a junior project manager at a firm I recommend paying back every cent you diverted from Madison's trust and the company accounts. You wanted a new life, Jeffrey. This is it. A life of honest work and absolute accountability." He looked at the pen as if it were a weapon. He realized there was no exit strategy, no offshore accounts to save him. He was a man who had spent his life pretending to be the architect, only to realize he had been living in a house of cards I had allowed him to occupy. He signed. His hand shook so much the ink feathered on the page. I took the paper, blew on it to dry the ink, and stood up. You have 10 minutes to leave this building, Jeffrey. Don't look back. There's nothing left here for you to audit. 6 months later, the colonial house on Westover Drive has a new name on the mailbox, Madison's name. I visit her on Sundays, and we drink coffee on the porch I built with my own savings. Jeffrey is working. Truly working. For the first time in his life. He calls Madison occasionally. But she's busy. She's a junior associate now, specializing in white-collar crime. She learned from the best. As for me, I sit in my office, 40 floors above the city. I opened my old marriage file today, the one I'd been using as a digital evidence locker. I stared at the years of red lines, the thousands of hours of invisible labor, and the millions of dollars I'd protected. Then, I hit the delete key. The screen flickered white for a second, then went clear. No more red lines. No more Project Clarity. Just a clean slate. My worth was never tied to his ledger. It was always my own. That night, for the first time in 30 years, I slept through until morning. No noise. No guilt. Just the quiet peace of a balanced account. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you built up, type Sovereign in the comments. Share this with one person who needs to remember their own power.